Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. A lot of things to talk about. Donald Trump got indicted, arrested, and arraigned. What is the implication for the world and America's role in it? Then we'll take a look at spying by the Chinese from Cuba. How dare they? And Tony Blinken is going to Beijing for the long postponed trip to have a conversation with the Chinese, his first visit as Secretary of State. And finally, the counteroffensive in Ukraine is underway, probing attacks by the Ukrainians. And the big question, where does this end? Here to talk about all of these issues today are Susan Glasser, commentator, Washington commentator for The New Yorker. Susan, great to have you back.
Oh, so glad to be with you. Thank you, Ivo.
And Carla Anne Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, and previously of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Carla, great to have you back as well.
Thanks, Ivo. Great to see you.
And Giles Whittell, who is World Affairs Editor at Tortoise Media. Giles, great to have you back as well.
Thanks for having me.
Susan, let's jump right in. Trump's indictment, huge story, of course, in the United States, and we will be dissecting and living this day in and day out. But the big question, I think, for our audience is not what will it do for politics in the United States, although many will be interested in that too, but how is this seen in the rest of the world? What does this do for America's image, America's ability to get stuff done, and America's engagement around the world?
Ivo, there's so much to unpack here and so many different directions we could go with this. Let's just start with the indictment itself, which is, it's the first ever federal criminal indictment of a former president. It does represent, even in an era of, constant norm breaking in our politics due to Trump, we tend to, sort of get desensitized to it. But this is a moment, and it's a significant moment. So we should note that, especially because the charges contained within the indictment are not only, serious in and of themselves, that a former president would be charged in our federal court system, but also they get very directly to the question of American national security and what kind of president Donald Trump was and what kind of president he might be in the future were he to come back. And so this isn't an academic exercise, but this is a case against not just a former U.S. president, but against the front runner for the Republican nomination. And so those two aspects, I think, are now colliding. As far as the charges themselves go, it's a 44-page indictment that was released in conjunction with this, 37 different counts. He is charged with having illegally possessed hundreds of documents that he took with him, classified documents that he took with him after his presidency, and that are stored in boxes in Mar-a-Lago. I'm sure everyone who's listening to this has already seen the extraordinary photographs that were released as part of the indictment that show stacks of boxes in Mar-a-Lago, in the ballroom, in a bedroom, and even in the bathroom. Endless commentary, of course, about that, including the kind of super embarrassing spin that Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, offered on Trump's behalf. He said, well, they can lock the door. People, of course, immediately pointed out that usually bathrooms lock from the inside. So unless someone's in those boxes locking the door, probably not that secure. The documents that he was specifically charged with possessing in the indictment are actually only a subset of the hundreds. It's 31 of what appear to be the most sensitive classified documents. And it strikes me that the prosecutors were very sensitive to the idea of not wanting people to say, oh, there's too much classification in American government, and these aren't really secrets, they're just stuff. So they seem to have avoided some of that criticism by going for an indictment that really focuses on things that are almost inarguably matters of national security. According to their understandably vague description in the indictment document, these include America's nuclear secrets. It includes secrets of our allies. They include possible military response plans, both of the United States and its allies. Sensitive information about foreign leaders and descriptions of the vulnerabilities of foreign countries. In other words, these are things that strike really at the core of American national security. And the idea, by the way, that Trump would have, including nuclear secrets of the United States stored possibly in the insecure bathroom of Mar-a-Lago. I'm sure, Ivo, as a former senior U.S. official, this one hits home to you in particular. You get in big trouble if you're anybody else and you do something like this. So that's one aspect. Just quickly, I would sort of point out the bigger set of questions that are wrapped around this, which is how does it affect how people view the American presidency, Trump's prospects for coming back. This is, as I understand this from a number of recent trips internationally, especially among European partners and allies, a huge and growing concern. I think there was a bit of denial up until earlier this year, maybe even until very recently, among U.S. allies that Donald Trump actually could come back, that he could be the Republican nominee, and that he could even win the presidency again. I think people are having to take that much more seriously now. And this is certainly a reminder, not only what the Trump presidency was like, a presidency that did not follow regular order, and which extraordinary lapses like the one he's now accused of, taking hundreds of classified documents, that could have happened. And yet the prospect is if he returns to the White House, that it would be even more likely for things like this to occur because Trump would be even less constrained. He would be much less likely to hire advisors who were trying on the national security side to rein him in. He would be looking and have a better sense than he did in his first term in office of what it takes to assemble essentially a team of loyalists who would do whatever he wants, even if it were potentially illegal or potentially going against what others view as the national security interests of the U.S. And I'll leave you with this. I noticed the other day that Joe Biden gave a talk at a reception here in Washington for chiefs of mission, basically, U.S. Ambassadors here to the United States, foreign leaders. And his opening remark was a sort of a telling anecdote about his first meeting, with some of our closest allies after coming into office. And he quoted Macron, the president of France, saying to him, like, when, everybody was saying, "Oh, thanks, Joe, America's back, congratulations." And, Macron said, "Yeah, America's back, but for how long?" And that's a question that's looming over, I think, every foreign policy conversation we're going to have today, including especially the war in Ukraine. Donald Trump is an outright cheerleader for Vladimir Putin. I don't think anyone thinks he would continue this support for Ukraine. And so the question looms over all of our conversations, which is, for how long?
For how long, Susan? Lots of things to pick up on there. Really nicely done. Let me start, Carla, with you. Pick up any thread that you want, but I think a core issue is this realization around the world, not only that Donald Trump might in fact become back as the president of the United States, but what does it tell us about the country, and what image are we projecting in the country that someone who is indicted in fact becomes more popular, at least within a political party, and the rallying effect that you have seen with the wholesale denunciation of the entire justice system, sort of a core of the American identity, the idea of the rule of law, being challenged, and how do you effectively counteract that part as you think about engaging the world and as the world looks at what's going on?
The but for how long is sort of the essence. It's the conversation that we had all of the time right after Biden was elected, and it sort of calmed down. We didn't hear about it all that much. People were taken up with all these other things, particularly the strength that the U.S. showed in its leadership going into the Ukraine war. We didn't hear a lot about it. And I think, what this has gone to, it's just reminded me how many conversations I had when Trump was in about how unreliable the United States particularly was on the intelligence front. People were really flipping out in the intelligence community here and in the intelligence community around the world because they depend so much on the United States as a leader in intelligence. And when Trump did things like, when the Russian foreign minister and ambassador came into the Oval Office and they gave away Israeli secrets about an potential ISIS attack, or when he tweeted out, super secret, high resolution photos of an Iranian missile launch, what happened was, the people were much, much less willing to share information with us. And that was something that really mattered to our intelligence community and really mattered to other intelligence communities. And you're beginning to hear this once again. It's a reminder. It's not anything new. It's just a reminder of something that people were in denial about. Things were getting back to normal. And just the chaos of the Trump years and the danger. Because if you don't have American leadership in intelligence, if you don't have American leadership in foreign policy, we all know what happens there. So this is the nightmare coming back. This is just a reminder. And as you said on the rule of law, you know how much people internationally follow what Kevin McCarthy says, follow the ins and outs of all these things. But just the general, from January 6th on, all of this is of a piece that the United States is unreliable.
Giles, this I hear this constantly when I talk to foreign leaders about the lack of reliability of the United States, which is not even just Trump. It's deeper than that in some ways. But and again, pick up anything you wanted. But one particular issue, this is also the week in which Boris Johnson resigned, in which there was a scathing report by the House of Commons on him lying to Parliament, which is a huge issue. And sort of a larger piece that the fact that former leaders get prosecuted and indeed go to jail is not necessarily something unique to the United States. It's happened in South Korea. It's happened in a whole variety of places in which, in fact, the rule of law is held sacred, and even though it politically gets concocted as something nefarious, it is in fact how our systems are working. So reflect on what's happened in Britain, because it's interesting, and there is this connection between, of course, Boris Johnson and Donald Trump on the one hand, but also sort of isn't this how the system is supposed to work, and isn't that part of the way and how we should be looking at this?
Yeah, I mean, there is a more positive spin to put on this extraordinary confluence of events, the remarkable parallels between what's happening in Washington and what's happening in London, which, as you say, is the rule of law playing out. There are differences in that I think amongst voters and the body politic in Westminster generally, there's a feeling over here that Johnson is now toast. In fact, just today, it's been revealed that he's taken up a new job as a columnist. It's back to his old trade, really, on a six-figure salary, which in these media markets is big numbers, for the Daily Mail, which kind of confirms that he's pulling out of politics. And there's a general bipartisan sigh of relief over that, in contrast to the much more partisan reaction to the Trump indictment. But as to Trump himself, I think over here we're still in the phase of absorbing the detail of the indictment, which does three things. It, as you've all pointed out, it highlights the hypothetical danger to global security, to the integrity of U.S. intelligence, were Trump to become president again. But at the same time, it shows in wonderful, trenchant, almost TV drama language, the rule of law at work. And it poses the question, surely, given the strength of the material, the smoking gun, the remark, for example, quote by Trump, that I shouldn't be showing you this. I'm misquoting him, but you know the line I'm referring to, but I'm going to anyway, and what seems to have been an attack plan on Iran, a sense that surely that will begin to cut through in a bipartisan way, so long as people on both sides of the political divide can be persuaded to absorb it. That said, there's a number that sticks in my head, which is 85. I think sort of 3 days ago, when this story was still breaking, that 85% was the proportion of registered Republican voters who quickly, unequivocally sided with Trump over this. And I think this is clearly a political question as much as a legal one. And strong as the case is against him, and Bill Barr, his own attorney general, has made that point, the kind of argument that Trump himself advanced on the day of the arraignment to guests at Bedminster in New Jersey, I was just too busy to think hard about what to do with these boxes. That could work politically. So that the question for us as observers is, what's going to happen to that 85% number? Will it go up or down? I have no idea.
Yeah, no, Giles, I think you've made some really important points for people to chew over. Number one, there is a difference. I think there's a pronounced difference between what now appears to be the end of Boris Johnson's career for political career for now, for flagrantly lying to, the British public, flouting the rules, eschewing norms during COVID and otherwise. Many of the things that Donald Trump did that have actually fostered his popularity among his hardcore Republican voters. And so I think that is a pronounced difference to us, here on this side of the pond, in the sense that it shows the difference, perhaps, between the parliamentary system and our political system here in the United States. I'm sure there are others as well about, what the political load will bear, essentially. And, Donald Trump has shown that barreling past norms and laws and rules and regulations has been a part of his appeal rather than undercutting it. And to your point, just a little bit, of sort of information for folks. The wave of polling after this indictment is very similar to the wave of polling after his first criminal indictment in Manhattan, which is to say that his support from Republican primary voters has gone up rather than down. At this point, he is consistently well over 50% in national polls of the Republican nomination. There is essentially zero precedent in modern U.S. elections for someone who is that dominant of a front runner to lose the nomination. Now, of course, you can say, well, there are so many other ways in which, he's a historical outlier, so we don't know if that will apply. But, at this point, there's a large and growing field of Republican primary candidates that would seem to help Donald Trump rather than hurt him, as it did in 2016, by dividing what anti-Trump vote there is, number one. Number two, there's one of the reasons that the field has grown is because of the perceived weakness of the guy who was supposed to be the main challenger, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And, I think had he emerged as a more dominant, kind of consolidated the non-Trump vote, some of these people wouldn't have run. But in fact, not only has his campaign failed to benefit, but I noted that in some of the early states like Iowa and New Hampshire, where Trump has not been going up or has even been going down, what's interesting is that Ron DeSantis has not been going up. And I think that's very revealing. And so I think he's a very weak, almost like a Jeb Bush-like character, who is going to have a hard time, although he has a ton of money, taking out Trump. And, this was always the problem with people who failed to, claim to be running against Donald Trump, but don't have the, strength or whatever you want to call it to actually attack the front runner. Like, why go for the guy who's sucking up to Trump and wants to replace him when you can have the real thing? And so again, this is, I know, a foreign policy show, but in many ways, right, since Donald Trump first entered American politics in 2015, the biggest foreign policy story in the world is unfortunately what happens in American domestic politics.
Yeah, no, that's.
I have a question for Susan or for Ivo or for Giles, which is there's the accretion question, because the Bragg indictment seemed pretty minor. This one seems much more significant, especially for those of us who work in the national security world. Then you're going to look at whichever is going to come next, which is either Smith for January 6th, and then you're going to have the Atlanta one for please steal the election for me, and as well as the false electors one. Is there the possibility that the constant number of indictments does have an impact on people? I mean, I think it's really early to know. I mean, I know it's remarkable that 2 hasn't had the impact, but one does wonder if just the sheer number of them is going to have more of an impact.
You know what? It's a great point. We are expecting that it's very likely that he could be indicted in Georgia on state charges stemming from his efforts to intervene after 2020 to overturn the Georgia election results. And remember the famous phone call with the Georgia Secretary of State that was on tape, just, you need to get me 11,000 more votes. So we're expecting charges potentially to be filed in the next couple months over the summer in Georgia. Also, there's the January 6th and sort of post-2020 efforts to overturn the election, which is really the core of the special counsel's investigation, Jack Smith, who just indicted him on the classified documents. So he's shown he's willing to do it. So a lot of people actually think that in their minds, it's more likely now rather than less that Smith would go ahead and charge Trump in that case as well. And so then you could be looking at a huge number of cases. So that could, of course, undercut him politically. However, and this is one big and interesting, however, that just argues almost for chaos, and that is the timetable. To be blunt, in short, these people took too long. And unfortunately, we are looking at a situation where it is almost inconceivable, at least as I look at the calendar, that any of these court cases would be resolved in a meaningful way before the Republican primaries are over and Republicans have made a decision about who is their nominee. In fact, you are in a situation where it's almost going to be a permanent split screen aspect of next year's primaries for Democrats and Republicans. There's court dates already being set in January of next year when the first races begin. The court case in Manhattan right now is currently scheduled to start in March of next year, right after Super Tuesday voting. And of course, that's the scheduled beginning of it. Any motions and arguing could delay that even further. So I just think that we're looking at a really chaotic and scary situation, but nobody should really expect that these cases are going to be, wrapped up with a bow one way or the other and guilty or not guilty verdicts rendered in time for the Republican electorate to have the benefit of that knowledge.
Yeah, I think. Susan, that's right. And I guess the big issue, it seems to me, is how the world will look at that chaos and that split screen, and how does it react about the reliability of the United States and its ability to do what many would expect from the United States. And that's an issue that I think we will be grappling with, particularly as I think, a good moment to move on. We really are grappling with 2 other very, very, very big cases. One is the relationship with China, and the second is the relationship with Russia and the war in Ukraine. Both of which are influenced by how the United States leads, whether it leads, and how it behaves itself at home. And Carla, I mean, turn to you now on sort of this revelation in the Wall Street Journal, first sort of kind of denied and then openly acknowledged, of the Chinese using Cuba as a means to spy on the United States, that led to this incredible political outcry, as if the idea of a country spying on the United States was somehow new or novel. It is, after all, in Cuba that it was said that people were shocked that there was gambling going on. Well, they're shocked that the Chinese spy on us and that they try to do it from places close to our coast. But that was happening on the one hand, and on the other hand, the administration was trying to handle it in such a way that it wouldn't interfere with the planned visit, now, I guess, underway as we speak, of Antony Blinken flying to Beijing for his first meeting in China since becoming Secretary of State. So bring us up to date about where we are and how we should think about this.
Well, first of all, I have an arcane skill set here, having written about Cuba a long time ago, but still, the Cubans have a long history of hosting spy bases. In 1961, the Soviets opened this SIG-INT facility, which is what we're talking about with the Chinese, in a place called Lourdes. It closed in 2002. There's been constant talk about the Russians reopening it, and it's not surprising. It's really close to the United States. It's a great place to pick up signals intelligence, and as you said, Ivo, shock that there's spying going on here. We don't know about this deal with the Chinese. The administration did something very squirrely when this report first came out. They said it was inaccurate. Although as a longtime Washington reporter, we all know, all of us as reporters know that when someone says something's inaccurate, it means that it's accurate, but we just got something slightly wrong about it. And then they came back and, said, yes, it was actually there already. It's been there since at least, 2019 or before, and was actually upgraded. So what is it about 2019? Oh, yes, not on our watch during the Trump administration. Now, why were they, being so squirrely about it? Because they didn't want it to derail the Tony Blinken visit. The last one was derailed by the spy balloon. And that was because people were, so shocked on the Hill. And the difference was that was actually an incursion in U.S. airspace. This one is something that's going on off the coast. It's not the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it did die down, and they're going ahead with this. But it is a testimony to how fraught this relationship is that, if you remember, this Tony Blinken visit was agreed to in November of last year when Biden and Xi met on the outskirts of the G20 meeting. And it took, first February, then it was canceled because of the spy balloon. And it's taken this long for them to get this together. And it shows you how difficult this relationship is. And I don't think it's going to be a really friendly visit anyway. Last week, the Chinese called, or this week, the Chinese called and lectured Blinken even before he got on the plane. The Americans are determined to go ahead with it because it has been such a difficult relationship, and because the Chinese have been ghosting us. Meanwhile, there have been Chinese planes buzzing American planes, ships almost crashing into each other. Really a strong argument for having any possibility for communications, which is why they're pushing ahead. What do the Chinese want out of this? I think they want to diss the Americans a little bit more for political reasons internationally, but they also want a better economic relationship because their economy's not bouncing back as much as they wanted. So we'll have to watch whether this insult game continues, and it's really an uncomfortable relationship with Blinken, or whether they tone it down once he gets there.
Giles, there's a terrific book on the origins of World War I called Sleepwalking. What is it called? The Sleepwalkers, something like that. And you have this sense that both sides are so focused on their internal politics that their ability to talk to each other and manage a relationship, which really is fraught. It's a very difficult relationship. Rising power, quote, declining power, maybe not declining as fast as the rising power would hope or expect. And maybe the rising power isn't rising as fast as it would hope and expect. And both sides playing games in one form or another, and sitting, on the sidelines, but very much part of the consequences of how this relationship developed. How do you see it in London? How do you think the Europeans are looking at it? And put your shoes of the Japanese or people in Asia as they are looking at this tension and trying to figure out a way how they can avoid being squeezed in what looks like an increasing confrontation.
Well, we're much closer to an actual war at this end of the Eurasian landmass, and therefore perhaps doubly neuralgic about the idea of a second one erupting at the eastern end. I think a certain Henry Kissinger is among those who subscribe to the sleepwalking, if you're not careful view, isn't he? As he passed his 100th birthday, he's been warning people with a certain amount of first-hand experience about this what's at stake here. I just say two things. One about history. Let's remember that since the 60s, American spy planes have been buzzing, U-2s have been buzzing Chinese airspace. Much more recently, much newer spy planes have been doing the same kind of thing. And it would be considered professional malpractice if the CIA wasn't properly entrenched all around China, from Singapore to South Korea. So to that extent, you have the makings of a double standards argument on the Chinese side, which they're very willing to make. And let's remember that it's a similar argument that the Russians make about encirclement by NATO in Eastern Europe. So the shocked response to Chinese eavesdropping in Cuba is pretty shallow. The other point on sleepwalking that I wanted to make is just last weekend, I was lucky enough to host a session with Rana Mitter, a terrific Chinese historian of China, and Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, in a field in Oxfordshire. And I, not being a Taiwan expert, I'm deeply worried about the prospect of this relationship spiraling out of control and coming to blows before we realize what's happening. Couple of numbers that reassured him, Rana, were 5 and 25. It's been estimated, forgive me, I can't remember the source, but he only deals in good ones, that a military conflict over Taiwan would inflict roughly a 5% hit to US GDP over the medium term, but a 25% hit to Chinese GDP. And that alone, given the narrow margins that the Xi Jinping regime is working with in maintaining some kind of a social contract with his 1.4 billion people, is, when push comes to shove, a pretty good guarantee that there are built-in obstacles in place to full-blown conflict over Taiwan.
Well, that's a reassuring thought, Susan. Of course, part of the sleepwalking argument is it's not a rational calculation that leads you to go to war. It is slipping into it because, as the Chinese said, we don't want to talk to you because we know you want to talk to us. Therefore, it would be a favor for us to talk to you. Which, by the way, is the critics of the Biden administration's same argument, that talking sort of is weakness, and we know from the Cuban Missile Crisis that it was only by talking that we actually were able to figure out how to avoid crossing the brink here. So, I mean, Susan, how relieved should we be that there, in fact, now is going to be major high-level conversation? May actually lead to a meeting between Xi and Biden in November, and how important is that? And secondly, how worried should we be about the domestic politics of this issue, as we go to an election season, making it that much harder to avoid miscalculation?
Look, the view certainly has long been that jaw is better than war, and that it's always better to, the more you can engage with potential adversaries, the more you can understand them, the less the risk of miscalculation. Now, of course, I'm not sure I entirely buy that, actually, given the overwhelming, kind of organizational and political logic that seems to be pulling these two capitals, Washington and Beijing, farther and farther apart. And, it wasn't for lack of engagement in some sense with Vladimir Putin that we came to this catastrophic situation of his invasion of Ukraine. It was a fundamental series of misunderstandings that played out over 2 decades, in many ways, right? It's not, we met with Vladimir Putin, we engaged with him, we built a whole, what we saw as a framework for potentially incorporating Russia as well as China into, the institutions of, kind of the international order. And that was a failed approach. And it was also a misunderstanding of Putin. And by the way, Putin's misunderstanding of the United States. He fundamentally, I think, did not understand in February of last year that Joe Biden and that NATO and Western allies were actually going to stand with Ukraine as long and as robustly as they ultimately chose to do. And so that was Putin's misunderstanding, as well as perhaps our failure to communicate clearly what we were going to do. And I think we're certainly at a risk of that when it comes to China and Xi. Here in Washington, there has been a dramatic swing in both Democratic and Republican views toward China. And so from this kind of like essentially arguably failed theory of the case that, more engagement and economic intertwining would inexorably lead to internal democratization in China. Obviously, it's gone in the other direction. You now have Democrats as well as Republicans, many of whom believe that some kind of outright conflict is actually inevitable. And my fear, of course, and the fear of many people, is that the feeling of inevitability leads inexorably to that. It can create that sort of a reality. And I think, it was interesting to hear Giles point, that when you're sitting in Europe, much closer to an actual war between Russia and Ukraine that could potentially embroil other European partners, that you don't want to, even entertain this. But unfortunately, here in Washington, I would say not only is it being entertained, but there is a very interesting and, to my mind, still very hard to understand strand of thinking among Republicans that, in fact, this is the real potential conflict. The real war is between the U.S. and China, the long-term strategic war. And that therefore, I don't understand this leap of logic, but nonetheless, you hear it more and more from influential Republicans. Therefore, we should not even be supporting Ukraine. Just let the Europeans deal with that kind of mess because we have more important things to deal with. I think this visit of Secretary of State Tony Blinken is very significant. I think the restarting of relations, this is not the first indicator of that, but one of a number of them, including 2 days of robust private conversations between Jake Sullivan, the U.S. National Security Advisor, and a counterpart in Vienna last month. And I think that was very significant. There have been other contacts at the cabinet level. Worrisomely, there's not enough military to military contact at the high level between the United States and China, although that, in my understanding, has been the case for actually quite a long time. But look, it seems to me that we are getting a pretty clear signal from China right now that they want to have more engagement than they have had for the first couple of years of the Biden administration. I'll be interested how much they are leaning on China in regards to the war between Russia and Ukraine and using some of their leverage. Remember, Putin and Xi have, pronounced to the world what they call a no limits partnership. And I think there'll be a lot of probing by U.S. officials to find out what that really means and where the actual limits are.
That's a great segue, Giles, to the issue of Ukraine and sort of the end game. The counteroffensive, as everyone has noted, including President Zelensky, is now sort of started, although it looks like it's a lot of probing before we see the real counteroffensive going. It's way too early to say whether it's going well or good, but it is not too early to say about where, what's the end game here. And it seems to me that we have two very different views of this, and they are reflected in the government. One is an end game that expels Russian forces from every inch of Ukrainian territory, which is clear what the Ukrainians want, and there are a lot of people who want to support them in doing so. And then the second one, which I noticed, is what President Biden said just earlier this week, which President Macron said, that we're trying to help the Ukrainians to get in the best possible position to have a negotiation. That once, you only negotiate when you haven't been able to expel everybody off your territory, or at least that makes it more important. And the China angle as part of that, how to convince Vladimir Putin that there is, in fact, a better way out to achieve his objectives, or whatever it is that he's trying to do, by jaw rather than war, may be the issue. How do you see it, Giles? Do you see this as a common conflict between sort of the major supporters of Ukraine militarily with the Ukrainian government, or how do you see this playing out?
I do think, to your final point, that were Xi to choose to lean in, he, perhaps more than anybody else, could have a material impact on Putin's thinking. Remember the Samarkand conference last year, when it was not just Xi, but a bunch of Central Asian leaders as well, and Modi. Made it very clear to Putin that they were not viscerally with him on this war and asked him essentially why he was doing it, and not quite to cease and desist, but I think she certainly has that potential influence, though he's shown very little inclination to use it recently. I mean, I agree, Ivo, with your analysis about the two principal ways this could play out. Ukrainian forces could find a way through these very significant defenses, cut the land bridge. Melitopol is the city that you need to keep in mind because it's been a center of partisan activity. Were Ukrainian forces to manage to get that far before winter draws near, that would be very, very significant. And the idea of completely liberating Ukraine's territory would remain on the table. But then the second scenario that you sketch out, in which the stalemate continues, I suggest has two variants. In both cases, there is pressure from both sides to talk. But in one, NATO essentially offers Ukraine accelerated membership. There is already a process, a candidacy process, on which all 31 members are agreed. And in that event, I think it's conceivable that Zelensky would feels that the security guarantees on offer were sufficient to talk. However, in that event, it's very hard to see the other side, Putin, agreeing to any negotiated settlement. The other variant of the second choice, the stalemate choice, the let's talk choice, is when that kind of a concrete guarantee from NATO is not on the table. And in that circumstance, the Ukrainian side would be highly unlikely to agree to any negotiated settlement. And it would be a grim scenario in which Zelensky, were he to want to stay in power, would have to say, we fight on, we fight alone. And in that circumstance, it would be grim indeed. It would be escalating losses, probably with or without F-16s. But it's a very bleak set of scenarios from where I sit, unless this long-delayed spring counteroffensive, now summer counteroffensive, finds the kind of momentum that the Kherson or the Kharkiv breakthroughs last year found. And we're not at that point yet. Just one final point, which, I mean, it's a tactical rather than a strategic one, but it's well, actually two. We've heard recently reports that Russian troops have been offered bonuses, literal cash bonuses, for taking out Western supplied kit. And that is a really key factor in motivation for Russian forces. And the other one is there is evidence that, as in Stalingrad, as in the Second World War, you have barrier troops, I think they're called, or shoot in the back units, who are stationed behind the Russian defensive lines to deter deserters, if necessary, by shooting them. We're at that stage. In so many respects, it's reminiscent of World War II, and that one of many reasons why nobody should think this is going to be over quickly. That's
sobering, but I think really well put, Giles, in terms of the dilemmas and the problems that we face. Carla, last word to you. I think one of the issues that some of us, and I know people inside the administration, are worried about is a third scenario, sort of catastrophic success, that in fact the counteroffensive works and the people who are supposed to shoot the Russians in the back actually run faster because they can possibly get home earlier, and the Russian army just collapses, really confronting Putin with a fundamental choice between utter defeat and escalation. And that might be the circumstance under which escalation, meaning the use of nuclear weapons, because that's the only form of escalation left, is on the table. How worried should we be about that scenario, and what would we need to do to try to prevent it?
This has hung over every calculation, whether it's been tanks or HIMARS or everything. We've been self-deterring and then not self-deterring every step of the way. And since we have no idea what goes on in Putin's head, and the assumption has become, the Pentagon has become more and more confident, the White House has become more and more confident that he's not going to do it, except up until that moment. And we really just don't know. I just want to make one more point. I know we have no time left here, which is there are multiple audiences here that are watching this. NATO is watching it as, how well are they fighting as they make a calculation of whether or not to offer, this clear formal commitment, a calendar. U.S. Congress is watching it. If they do well, they're going to be much more willing to extend more aid. And Zelensky's really vulnerable because one of the reminders, as Giles said, is that they're losing already in the first week, losing an enormous amount of equipment here. They've lost Leopard tanks. They've lost an enormous number of Bradley fighting vehicles. They're going to need a lot of support to continue this, which gives them more leverage over Zelensky, leverage that we say we're not going to exercise, but they're going to need that support.
More sobering questions, and I think absolutely, Carla, there are always multiple audiences. However, for this show, we just have one audience. It's all of you who have joined us. We really thank you for having joined us here today again this week, and I want to thank Carla Robbins, Susan Glasser, and Giles Whittell for another really excellent conversation. Sobering though it is, that's the world this week. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That was great.